It's Eric Daly, Executive Minister for the region, and here with the staff team. Carmen, I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about your Human Flourishing project and what that's about and what we can look forward to.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. So, because of the way things rolled out with my onboarding and my first month as being moderator, and 2 weeks of that was spent in Germany at the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches as an observer, and it's like a church leader observer. I ended up having my first in-person meeting of the Moderators Advisory Committee the 3 days immediately following my installation, which I think has never happened before. And in part because there was space between my election and my installation. I wasn't elected on Friday afternoon and installed on Friday night. And because we'd known since the close of nominations that I would be the moderator. And so the 3 priorities we set for my work in my term as moderator were to engage in change-making conversations in Canada and the world, to broaden what engagement looks like inside the church and outside of the church, and to mentor a new generation of leadership. I had done a learning sabbatical earlier in the spring where I did a certificate in public policy analysis from the London School of Economics. And as part of that sabbatical, I had been invited to attend a forum at the Vatican called Humanity 2.0, which is part of this movement to create a human flourish, a global concept of human flourishing as an alternative measure to GDP. And this is not the first time something like this has been tried, but it's really bolstered by Harvard and Baylor universities, which have created a human flourishing project, a human flourishing network, and then Gallup is doing a human flourishing global study. So Humanity 2.0 was postponed to November. And so I went as moderator, and I think it's a really interesting way to think about the world, and it dovetails with another scholar who I really like, who's a British economist named Kate Raworth. And she talks about how if you can think of the economy less in terms of the traditional machine that gets taught in your like Econ 101 class, where you have like inputs and outputs, and like it goes through all of the different machinations of the economy, but instead of like a donut. And so you have 2 concentric circles, and the inner circle is our social foundations, and the outer circle is our planetary boundaries. And so she says all of our economic choices and policies should be trying to keep us within the center, what she calls the just and safe center, where we're upheld by our social foundations and then constrained by our planetary boundaries, and that we have overshoots of our planetary boundaries currently, and we have shortfalls in our social foundations. And so I decided that the change-making conversations that I wanted to have were around this idea of human flourishing. And so I'm going to be going across the country to 13 different cities and doing a number of events. They can all be like, they'll be concentrated into a 1-week process, but are also things that could be replicated as standalone events. So they will include a theological symposia with scholars across the country to talk about, and we're still trying to refine what the actual like call for paper will look like, but like scholarly discussions around human flourishing in Canada. Theologians from both Christian but also interfaith perspectives have to say around this project and what it could mean for our communities of faith and for our country. A public workshop that we're doing in partnership with Kindred Works, so we don't have to out me or the project as necessarily being a church thing, and we're not going to talk about faith, but for the business community to really use design thinking and some of the like future games designed by the Institute for the Futures and Jane McGonigal to imagine what does the flourishing Canada look like 10 years from now, and what are you going to do as individuals and companies to get us there, and a public lecture. So I'm really excited to say that when we come to Kingston in November, I hope you will all come. Andrew Winston, who's an economist and ESG strategist for a number of transnational corporations, and he speaks widely across the world about transitioning to a green economy, is going to come and talk about his book, Net Positive, How Companies Who Give Back More Than They Take Can Thrive. And then we're also doing a church version of the public workshop that has where we're taking the public workshop and putting some theological and biblical rationale to it, and then inviting communities of faith to come and be in conversation with me and to do the same processes and envisioning exercises around what does a flourishing United Church of Canada look like 10 years from now, and how can we get there, and what are the things that we want to lift up and see, and then I'll probably preach somewhere in the region. So and then the one thing that I'm doing nationally is I'm having a national book club. So if you follow me on social media, like every January, I post the 20 or 30 books that I've read in the previous year. This year, my goal is to read 60, and I'm up to 23, I think, already. So reading is a huge passion of mine. I make a lot of time for it. And I think it'd be really interesting to have some conversations with the wider church about some of my favorite books and why I think they're important. So that'll be a big chunk of my work for the next 2 years. Your region's the second region on the docket. So excited to come and spend some time with you in November. And it's not my regional visit. So, if there are things that like come up organically in your region and you want to send an invitation, you can coordinate with Eric for that to happen. So this is not like replacing the traditional moderator's visit.
Agreed. So tell us about 3 books on your read the summer list.
2 of the books I'm reading right now, which are both excellent. I put out there's a clergy group on Facebook for the United Church that not everybody's a part of, but some of us are. And I put out a call because I was looking for books about rural experience in Canada, like what's life like for rural people and rural communities. And I'm thinking like real, like the smallest rural, like towns of 100 or 300 or 2. And somebody had suggested Sharon Batala's The Perfection of the Morning. And so I'm about like 60, this is it, about 60% done. So she's a Saskatchewan novelist. She wrote Lilac Moon, The Girl in Saskatoon, but this is her memoir of her experience of leaving Saskatoon and getting married to a rancher from southwestern Saskatchewan, in like the most arid, semi-arid part of the province, and learning from nature and learning from her husband's way of life. And it is beautifully written. It's such a deep joy. I did my internship in Saskatchewan, and I'm still learning things about the prairies and the traditional grasslands there and also the impacts of colonization on Indigenous people in the province. Like it's a beautifully well done book, and I'm really enjoying it. The other book I'm reading right now is The Long Road Home by Deborah Thompson, who's professor of racial equity or something at McGill. She is 5th generation on one side of her family, 4th generation on the other side of her family, Black Canadian, with roots from her family escaped to Canada from the US. And so like me, she's a border jumper. She's moved back and forth between Canada and the US. And it ties into the American conversation on anti-Black racism, but in a way that is uniquely Canadian, and talks about the difference between Canadian experiences of anti-Black racism, the Canadian history of slavery, and the legacy of generations of Black families that have been here for 4, 5, 6 generations, and is one of the most nuanced, again, it's a memoir, and one of the most nuanced books that I've read on anti-Black racism in Canada, that ties into some of the other things that are really good resources from the US, but sort of Canadianizes that conversation. Another one that's on my reading list for the summer, Arrival City and Maximum Canada by Doug Saunders, which are books that I'm considering for my book club. So I had the CEO of a big national general contractor, and I go for breakfast every once in a while when I'm in Toronto. And he told me that the housing crisis is not going to end because Canada is under the radar pushing for us to grow our country to 100 million people by 2050. And that's the official government policy under both the Harper and Trudeau governments, because we need that size of a population in order to support the tax base to like keep our infrastructure from failing, which kind of blew my mind. So I'm interested to read some of Doug Saunders' work on that.
Carmen, I was thrilled to hear you make your comments about the sort of both and situation and the need to be listening to people from all the different points of view. I thought it was interesting. So this isn't so much a question, it's just a comment about that. And I thought it was interesting that this morning on CBC, they were interviewing Jim Cuddy with his thoughts on Gordon Lightfoot. And Jim was bringing up the point that at one point there was this big support group that had met together to play as bringing in money to help with saving old growth forests. And he started off when he was introduced, he says, well, loggers got to eat too. And everybody was shocked by that. But I think it brings out this point that every question we have, everything that's facing us has a whole host of sides that we need to take into account.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, I'm the daughter of commercial fishers and granddaughter of a logger. So I come from resource extraction industry and had the most ferocious fights with my dad and my grandpa about my very idealistic worldview about protecting the environment as I started to learn about like PCBs and aerosols and the ozone layer and everything in high school. And, you know, and I grew up on a seine boat where we used to just throw our garbage overboard. Like, you know, we'd take the full garbage bin out of the thing and throw it, like tie it off and throw it, and off it would go down Johnson Straits and out into the Pacific Ocean. And the whole fleet did that. And fishing provided my family with a really comfortable standard of living. And, you know, that way of life is largely gone off our coast, but I think that there could have been more moderation, and that we could, you know, I wish that we had acted sooner to create a sustainable fishery. And that's true on like coast to coast to coast in this country. And it's, you know, we're doing the same thing to the earth in terms of mining, logging, agriculture. So I think it's important to have conversations around, like the Alberta Futures Project did a study and said they found that 70% of people who work in the oil sands would prefer to transition to renewable energy and working in the field of renewable energy, but they don't believe that there's a pathway for them to get there. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, there's some interesting dreaming to do together.
Catherine.
Hi, Carmen. I'm a minister here in Kingston. And I you could take this in any direction you like, but I'm wondering about your sense of the United Church's spiritual health, the state of kind of discipleship and faith formation in the church as a whole.
I think that there is a very broad spectrum across the church. I don't think that people's spiritual health is homogeneous. When I acknowledged my call to ministry, my grandfather was a United Church minister and 2 postgraduate degrees in homiletics. And he and I went for a walk when they were out for a visit in BC, and we went for a walk, and he said, I'm going to tell you the 3 best things and the 3 hardest things about being a United Church minister. In his experience, and I don't know that this to be 100% true, but I certainly see veins of it through the church. I think it also I think it's shifted because of the way that the demographics in the church have shifted. But he said that in a large percentage of his ministry that he found people's spirituality to be quite surface, and that they came to church because that's what good people did. There was like not always the strongest connection between like really rumbling with our scriptures and like deep spiritual practices and like why they were at church on a Sunday morning. I think that has probably shifted a lot because those of us who are still in church are there because we want to be there and not just because now, you know, with Sunday shopping and soccer and kids sports and things like that, like there's Christendom is no longer in Canada, and your option of being like at home with your family or at church with your family as being sort of the 2 things you could do on Sunday is no longer the case. But I certainly think that there is still maybe the remnants of that. I think that one of the ways that colonization has impacted the non-Indigenous church is that there is this like deep sense of angst or like collective shame around how could people in our church have done or society have done those things. And, we talk a lot about the physical and sexual and cultural abuses that happened, especially now that I'm moderator. One of the things that weighs really heavy on me is that despite my intentions, that my behavior can always be perceived as like me having done something in the name of God, as somebody who is set aside in this call to ministry. And I don't know that in our paid accountable ministry, we've always taken that spiritual power of being set aside seriously. I think that while I love the theology of the whole people of God, it's had really shadow sides to it around what it means to interact with each other in the name of God. And that like God wants life for us and for us to have it in abundance, and carrying around this albatross of shame of all of that hard history is not healthy for us either. That there is real work to do on being like forgiven and reconciled to Christ as people of faith through that. And so I also think that our spiritual freedom is connected to our economic and our political and our physical freedom. And when we are suffering in our political engagement with each other as like in the classical like polis sense of being in community and governance with each other as civil society, that the more unfreedoms we experience there, it is harder to have things sit well with your soul. Right. I mean, I think that's where some of the really hard parts of atonement theology come, like, well, this is just your cross to bear. Like, no, it's not. And I think that we're at a time when Jesus would be going into the temple and flipping the tables. And we need those times of righteous anger around injustice in order for our spiritual wellness to flourish. And it's we can't stop praying, and we can't pray our way out of this.
Thank you. Yes. And just, if I may, you've given us today just a glimpse into the incredible work that you're doing. And I hope that you feel upheld by the gratitude, the love, and the prayers of us and in the church and the wider church.
Thank you.
But I find that I'm looking for advice, actually. I've sensed challenges with change, that people find change really difficult. I don't know whether you experienced that or not, and whether you have any advice for us about the kinds of change that we are engaged in.
Yes, you so appreciative of your time and this wonderful conversation. You referenced Jane McGonigal and the work that you are focused on in looking long term at the health of the United Church and of course of our wider civil society. And I'm part of a Future Directions project with one of our congregations, and we have trouble looking even in the very medium term, and so I'm really keen to have you say a little more, if you can, about what it means to be looking and how we look 10 years out when some of us have trouble thinking about next week.
So two questions, one on the challenge of change and one on thinking big, I think is how I've been.
So I think the more we know and understand about brain science, that helps us with both. And so if you watched the video or the live stream of my installation, like this is something that I talked about around, our response to carried trauma, but also the ways in, like, we know through brain science that when we're confronted with a perceived or an actual threat, that we go into our limbic system of our brain and we have fight, flight, or freeze, right? So, and our bodies, like, we know from evolutionary brain science that our bodies don't know the difference between a perceived social threat and like a tiger at our door. So the actual chemical process that is happening in our brain is the exact same as like, oh, a bear is trying to break into my cabin versus like, what are we going to do in the future of the church? And when we're in our limbic system, become positional. We have a hard time thinking creatively, and we really need the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive function of our brains, in order to allow us to be open, creative, problem-solving, collaborative. Even just the action of saying, oh, I'm having a reactionary response to a perceived threat, like acknowledging that pulls us back into our executive function. And so I think like being really good about assessing where there might be perceived threat and looking at risk and naming risk, and then allowing you to think, okay, like, well, what if that wasn't the case? What if the worst didn't happen? Is an important way to like exercise our brains. And so one of my favorite business books is by my mentor, Julian Chapman. It's called The Managerial Leadership Journey, Unconventional Business Pursuit. And he talks about this Greek word anaklesis and how we like rest on our beliefs. And so one of the challenges with change management is I talked about this a little bit earlier, like we want to go back to what we know and to choose the safe option. So what I love about Jane McGonigal's book, I just put the link to her book Imaginable in that's the Goodreads link, is that she and her colleagues at the Institute for the Futures argue that we have to think about what is the best that can happen, but also what is the worst that can happen. And so she calls it future episodic thinking. And so you can't think too far into the future and you can't think too close to. And so they've chosen like 10 years as the sweet spot for, it's far enough away that you think of yourself or your community as like third party actors. And so it's not like directly, like actions are not directly attributable to you, even if you're thinking of yourself. And it's far enough away that you don't have what she calls a poverty of time. So like, oh, we could never do that in 10 years. Like the world is kind of your oyster in a 10-year sweet spot. But 10 years is also close enough that it feels tangible. Like it's something that you can get excited about and a future that you can imagine seeing. And so that's exactly the kinds of conversations I want to have through this congregational workshop or church workshop for communities of faith across the country is to actually go through some processes where we can practice that. And it is a practice, right? Like it's, I think learning, there's some great courses on Coursera, IDOU that teach design thinking and really thinking from a place of empathy and like, what's the experience that you're trying to resolve when you're solving a problem? So like not jumping straight to solutions, because when we think of there's a problem, I'm going to solve it, we maybe haven't looked at, to Ruth's point, like we haven't looked at all enough sides of it. And so if you imagine, they talk about it as like human-centered design. So starting with empathy, what's the type of experience that you're wanting to create, or that you can be a lot more creative.
Thank you, first of all, for reminding us the power of story. Through stories, we've learned more about you. We've learned about your passions and your priorities as the moderator of the United Church. We've also been reminded, at least I have, of the power of ideas and the power of ideas wherever they come from, how they can contribute to new possibilities. And I'm wonderfully optimistic and happy to be reminded about the national nature of the United Church. And I think you carry that very, very well. So thank you for taking time, for being with us.